talk about how much money to bring on a cruise. It's impossible to provide a one-size-fits-all advice about how much money to bring on a cruise. It really is. It's so subjective and it varies widely from person to person. So instead of giving you an amount, which would literally be impossible, I'm going to share with you some of the things that you need to plan to spend money for on a cruise, and then you just have to determine what you think you'll spend in each of these categories in order to devise a total planned cruise budget. But before we do that, let's talk about the issue of cash and whether it's even needed. So is cash needed on a cruise? A convenience of cruising is that all of your onboard charges are simply billed to the card attached to your stateroom account. So on the ship, other than optional tips, which we just talked about, it's essentially a cashless experience. Therefore, it's unnecessary to worry too much about having cash on hand when you're milling about the cruise ship, aside from those tips. Having cash for your visits to ports of call, however, that's advisable, and more on that in just a moment. But first, let's talk about whether or not it's necessary to convert currency for a cruise. Now, most ports are commercialized and they're accustomed to American travelers. So it's usually not necessary to convert US currency to foreign currencies. That's assuming that you're on a cruise that departs from the US, things like those Caribbean itineraries. This obviously is going to differ if you're embarking on a sailing in another country. If you're taking a European cruise that departs out of Amsterdam, you may need to convert your currency. For sailings outside of the United States, most of those don't require currency conversion. Most port vendors accept US currency credit and debit cards, although depending on the terms of your cards, you may incur an international transaction fee. Also, while most ports of calls on sailings that disembark from the United States will accept US currency, it's important to note that some of them, and I've really encountered this a lot in those smaller Caribbean islands like Antigua and St. Lucia, they may accept US currency, but only if the bills are in good condition. So no rips or tears, the bills can't be overly worn, and there cannot be any writing on the bills at all. Further, while they may accept US currency, they might provide change back to you in the form of local currency, so be prepared for that. When budgeting for your cruise, both how much cash to bring and how much you aim to spend overall, here are some general categories to consider. So again, think about each category, decide what you want to try to spend, and calculate your personal cruise spending budget accordingly. The first category is tips. As we just discussed, you may choose to tip employees on your cruise in addition to those included or prepaid gratuities. And you may also choose to tip service providers on your port day excursions. If so, you'll want to bring cash, including lots of singles and smaller bills. Another area is excursions. If you book an excursion through the cruise line, the charge will be billed to your stateroom account or prepaid if you booked in advance. If you book with an independent tour provider, you'll either pay in advance or sometimes on the day of your excursion. If paying on the day of your excursion, it's important to note some tour operators only take cash, although they usually will take US currency, but it's important to verify this with them in advance. Confirm whether or not they take cards, and if it's cash only, if they'll take US currency. I once booked an excursion in Belize and I just assumed they would take credit cards as payment, and I got all the way to the destination and ended up in a very awkward spot when I learned only then and there that it's a cash only situation. And I had not enough cash and there were no ATMs anywhere. I was able to work it out, but it created a pretty stressful moment that could have ruined the entire day. Taxis. Some taxi services at cruise ports accept credit cards, but this is never a guarantee. Even taxi providers at wildly busy commercialized ports like Cozumel, one of the biggest in the world, those taxi drivers typically do not accept credit cards, cash only, although they do usually take US currency. And for those less developed ports of call like Progreso and Costa Maya, it is almost a guarantee that taxi drivers will take cash only. So plan for your transportation costs and make sure you have enough cash on hand for that. Souvenirs. This is a hugely variable expense, but know that while most port souvenir vendors will take cards, paying cash might save you money, because that vendor might give you a discount for paying cash because they then don't incur those credit card transaction fees. You may also have more leverage with negotiation by paying in cash. So getting a better price may incentivize you to pay with cash versus card. And the last category to consider are extras, all the miscellaneous stuff. Because while cruises are all-inclusive, the cruise lines make a lot of money upselling cruisers on a ton of extras once you're on board. This includes things like photos, Wi-Fi, casino expenditures, specialty dining, drinks if you didn't buy the drink package. Some of these things can be prepaid, but if you didn't pay in advance, budget for these as part of your cruise planning process. You won't generally need cash for these things. They'll be billed to your stateroom account, but it's going to be an expense that you will incur if you do choose to partake in any of these miscellaneous things. And unless you plan to only eat on the ship and plan your meals around your time in port, you're likely going to incur costs with food and drinks when it comes to being off the ship on port days. So plan for that as well. Now, while this advice is generally applicable, I again want to stress the personal nature of both tipping and financial planning for expenses at port destinations. There really is no one-size-fits-all approach. I can't simply give you a number and tell you bring this much money. It's so independent. It's so subjective. What I recommend is using these guidelines, knowing the categories, make sure you understand situations where you might need cash versus card, and plan accordingly.